Introduction ng Revelation, Part 2. Point 2 na po tayo. Both the Roman historian Tacitus, in his Annals, and the writings of Pope St. Clement of Rome, who lived during the reign of Domitian, testify to the deaths of immense multitudes of Christians. No? Yung salita niya, yung description niya is immense. So hindi mabilang of Christians during the reign of Nero. But they do not mention any accounts of severe persecution during the reign of Emperor Domitian. Wala po silang nabanggit na ganung pangyayari sa panahon ni Domitian. Number 3. According sa Revelation 13, verse 18, wisdom is needed here, and one who understands can calculate the number of the beast, for it is a number that stands for a person. His number is 666. It appears to identify Nero as the beast, a title he certainly earned not only for his persecution of Christians, but for the murders of his own family members, including his first wife, his mother, and his pregnant second wife. Another critical passage for dating the book appears in chapter 17, verses 8 to 11. And in that passage, St. John seems to be speaking of two different lists of Roman rulers, possibly the two different official lists used by Roman historians. One list composed by Roman historian Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus during AD 69 hanggang 126 began with Julius Caesar, as you can see in the slide, naming 8 Roman emperors. The other list, sa right column po, by Publius Cornelius Tacitus, AD 56 to 117, also a historian and public official, began with Julius' successor, his great-nephew Octavian, which is also known as Caesar Augustus, and only named 7 emperors. Kasi nga po, hindi na niya sinama si Julius Caesar. Roman historian Tacitus begins his list of Roman emperors in his Annals, his History of Rome, with the name of the first man to bear the title Emperor of the Romans, Augustus Caesar, or si Octavian. However, the Roman historian Suetonius began his list in Lives of the 12 Caesars with Julius Caesar, even though Julius Caesar never officially bore that title, as did Diocletian in his Roman history and Flavius Josephus in the Jewish first century, a priest and historian in his History of the Jewish People entitled Antiquities of the Jews. So there were therefore 2 official lists in use in the 1st century AD. Pareho pong ginagamit yan noong araw. In Tacitus' list, Nero is the 5th name, but on Suetonius' list, Nero is the 6th emperor. According sa verse 10 of chapter 17, the 7 heads are also the 7 emperors. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain for a little while. Nero committed suicide with help from a servant in June AD 68. Ayan, nakikita niyo po, namatay po siya noong AD 68 after a reign of 14 years. He was immediately replaced by Galba, who was murdered in AD 69, and replaced by Otto, who only lasted 95 days before his murder. This historical succession seems to fit the passage in verse 10, verse 11. In the beast who was alive and is alive no longer is at the same time the 8th and one of the 7, and he is going to his destruction. So that's verse 11. So Otto is both number 7 and number 8 on the list of emperors. It is possible from this passage in verse 11 to place the written record of St. John's visions on Patmos to just after Nero's death, during the short reign of Galba, and before the destruction of the Jerusalem in AD 70. So kung ang pagbabasihan daw po itong verse 11, pwede pong itaya na isinulat ni St. John ang kanyang mga pangitain, ang kanyang mga visions on Patmos between Nero, after Nero's death and during the short reign of Galba and before the destruction of the Jerusalem in AD 70. So from AD 68 to AD 69 or 79, so maaring dun daw sinula. Domitian does not make the list because he would be number 11 or number 12 depending on the list. Makikita niyo po, nasa dulo si Domitian. There is also the interesting connection between the passage in chapter 13 verse 18. There is need for shrewdness here. Anyone clever may interpret the number of the beast. It is the number of a human being. The number is 666. So some ancient sources list this number as 616. In ancient time, most cultures did not have separate symbols for both letters of the alphabet and numbers. In both Hebrew and Greek, each letter of the alphabet also had a corresponding numerical value. However, in Latin, only 6 letters had a numerical value. Yung I, yung V, yung X, yung D, yung C. In Greek, The word gematria denoted the letter value of names, words, or phrases. The gematria of Neron Caesar, an alternating spelling of Nero's name in the 1st century AD, parang nilagyan lang po ng N yung Nero, in Hebrew is 666, while the sum of the letter number value of Nero Caesar is 616. The sum of the letters of the word Caesar God in Greek is also 616, and all 6 of the Roman numerals add up to 666. Iting na siya yung nababanggit na mabangis na hayop. Point 4, in Revelation chapter 11, verse 1, then I was given a long cane like a measuring rod, and I was told, get up and measure God's temple and the altar, and the people who worship there, but exclude the outer court and do not measure it, because it has been handed over to Gentiles. The Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem on the 9th of Ab, or July or August, in AD 70. If Saint John received a divine command to go to Jerusalem and measure the temple during the reign of Domitian, which is between AD 81 to 96, he would have protested. Sasabihin po sana niya na, how can I measure it? The temple is no longer there. It's no longer stood ng time po ng reign po ni Domitian. Now, if the temple was still standing, then the vision must have occurred before the temple's destruction in AD 70. So, ibig sabihin po talagang malayo doon sa reign ni Domitian. Tako na po tayo ngayon sa different schools of thought in interpreting Revelation. Karamihan po ng mga scholar ay sang-ayon na ang mga sulat para sa 7 simbahan sa Asia Minor ay naglalarawan ng mga kondisyon ng 7 makasaysayang simbahan sa panahon ni San Juan. Karamihan din sa mga scholar ang sumasang-ayon na ang huling bahagi ng Kapitulo 20 at buong Kapitulo 21 at 22 ay mga propesya o pangitain ng huling panahon or end of times. The end times will culminate in the second advent of Christ, the resurrection of the dead, the final judgment, the creation of the new heaven, the new earth, the new Jerusalem, and the eternal life of the saints with God in the heavenly sanctuary. So, magkukulminate na parang yan po yung pinaka-climax, climatic point po ng end of time. So the interpretation of the middle chapters of Revelation depends on 2 critical interpretative questions. One is, what is the historical reference of the visions? And what is the nature of the 1,000-year period described in chapter 20? So there are 5 different schools of thought on the interpretation of Revelation. It's called the preterist view. Latin word for past po, no? The fulfillment of all the events of St. John's visions took place during the period of the Roman Empire. And one of the most influential champions of this view was a Spanish Jesuit priest, Father Luis de Alcanzar. And this view has the strength of making John's vision exceedingly meaningful for the early church. Kasi po, ibig sabihin po nun, talaga pong para doon sa mga tao ng mga early Christians ang librong ito. But less relevant na po to the present age sa panahon natin. So some contemporary Catholic scholars have adopted a variant of this view. So yan yun. So para sa kanya, ito ay nakalipas na, no? Na nangyari sa panahon ng mga early Christians. The futurist view. Ang futurist view naman po, where Spanish Jesuit Doctor of Theology, Francisco Rivera, and Saint Robert Bellarmine were the champions of this view. This school of thought holds that the middle chapters, beginning with chapter 4 and including the concluding chapters of Revelation, apply strictly to the future. Kung kaya nga po ang tawag ay futurist. So ito daw ay para sa mga tao sa panahon ng mga nasa hinaharap, no? Today, most evangelical Protestants, including the rapture theorists and many Catholics, support a futurist interpretation. The difficulty with this view is that it robs Saint John's vision, no? It robs Saint John's vision of any meaning for the early Christians for whom he was writing. So, kung bako po may konting conflict ata kasi malinaw naman ang sinabi na para ito do sa nung sinulat ito ay para do sa 7 ang pinatutungkulan ay yung 7 simbahan, no? Yung early churches nung panahon na yon. So kung ang pagbabasehan lang is para lang kung ang pagbabasehan ay yung futurist view, eh parang nawala ng saysay na isulat ito ni San Juan para sa 7 simbahan ng panahon niya. Historicist view, for those who embrace the view that that the events described in the middle chapters have found their fulfillment throughout the past 2,000 years of the church history. So this view was adopted by medieval dissenters in the Catholic Church and became widespread in the Protestant Reformation movement because they could use it as an anti-papal propaganda. In this interpretation, the whore of Babylon is the Catholic Church para sa kanila, and the beast is the Catholic Pope. This view was popular with Martin Luther, John Calvin, and other anti-Catholic Reformation leaders. The historicist view is less popular today, but it still has its supporters. In the opinion of the historicists, the 7 trumpets equal 7 historical invasions of Christendom by enemy armies like the Goths and the Vandals, etc. The primary disadvantage to this view is that historicists fail to agree on which events of human history the symbolism of the vision foreshadows. Hindi naman nila ma-identify kung alin do sa history ng sangkatauhan ang pino-foreshadow ng mga symbolisms na makikita sa libro ng Pahayag. So yun naman yung failure ng historicist view. The spiritual idealist view. In this view, particular historical events and characters have no one-on-one correspondence to the scenarios and figures in the book of Revelation. Wala daw pong connection sa mga scenario at figures, no, na makikita sa Aklat ng Pahayag. Instead, John's imagery symbolizes spiritual realities depicting the fight between good and evil, or God and the devil, etc., that Christians witness in every generation. Excuse me. So in this approach, the references to the sun, moon, and stars, for example, are symbols for political rulers. And in this approach to Revelation, all of John's visions concern ideas and principles only. The strength of this view is that it secures the relevance of St. John's visions for all periods of church history, no? Pero ang kanyang kahinaan naman po is yung refusal niya to find a firm historical context to any of St. John's message. Eh bakit nga po ba kailangan nating i-connect sa history? Kasi para po mga malaman natin kung ano na po ba ang kalagayan o ano na po ba ang tinatahak natin at para saan ba ito? Ano bang halaga ng sinulat na to ni San Juan? At yun lamang po ang magiging parang pinakabasehan ng tao. Importante na makitaan ng koneksyon. Yun naman po ang failure ng spiritual idealist view. Progressive parallels view. This theory developed literary analysis of the book of Revelation. Literal daw po. And it is possible to apply it in the interpretation of a number of the 4 different schools of thought concerning St. John's visions. So, itong view na to, pwedeng i-apply, pwedeng ihalo do sa unang 4 na views na nabanggit ko po. This view holds that the structuring of the book is in 7 sections that run parallel to each other. So, parang magkasabay daw po yung nangyayari yung istorya. Each of these sections portrays the church and the world from the time of Christ's first advent to the time of his promised second advent. In other words, it is not a historical chronology. The story starts all over again with each new section, but is told or viewed from a slightly different perspective. Kumbaga po, pwede natin isipin na parang 7 libro na pareho ang kinukwento, pero kaya lang, since magkakaiba ang author, magkakaiba po yung perspektibo or yung approach ng pagkukwento. Pero iisa lang po yung takbo ng kwento. This view was suggested by Victorinos of Petao, who died under the Diocletian persecution of AD 284 to 305. And he said, this book does not set forth a continuous series of future events. Para sa kanya, hindi daw yun events, hindi siya future events, no? But repeats the same sequences of events under various forms. Yan, mapabasa yan sa Introduction to the New Testament by Bosimar. Now, while each of these schools of interpretation, in most forms, receives approval by the Catholic Church, it is not necessary to accept any one theory in its pure form. Mapapansin nyo naman po sa mga susunod na discussion is parang ang mga pinaghahalo-halo or hindi talaga pwedeng pure form kasi nga lalabas at lalabas may mali or may kulang. So many modern commentators may teach that one scenario in the middle chapters of the book of Revelation is a symbol of the present age, while maintaining that another is a prophecy of a future event. So parang pinaghalo po yung preterist at saka yung futurist. Nga. Saint Augustine held that the first resurrection in chapter 20 of Revelation, verses 5 to 6, refers to the present regeneration of the soul through baptism, and that the 1,000-year reign of Christ in chapter 20, verse 4 to 10, is a symbolic number that represents the era of the church between Christ's two advents. So nakita niyo po, yung sa 5 to 6 verses, parang first resurrection. And then, pagdating sa 4 to 10, ang pagkakapahulugan ni St. Augustine is, yun na po yung symbolic number that represents the era of the church between Christ's two advents. So, kumbaga, pinaghalo niya yung dalawang klase ng view. But he also taught that the Antichrist would be a specific individual who will appear toward the end of the history to persecute the church for a literal 3.5 years. Literal po niyang pinaniniwalaan nyo na ipipersecute ang church for 3.5 years.